Stone Ridge, Ohio, November 24th. A woman sits at a crowded Thanksgiving table, yet she has never been more invisible. The dining room is warm, heavy with the scent of roasted sage and expensive perfume, but for Margaret Stone, the air is suffocating. She watches her father raise a crystal glass, smiling as he hands the family empire to a brother who never earned it. To them, she is just a daughter, designed to be edited out of the legacy, a footnote in a history written by men. But silence is not always surrender. Sometimes it is the sound of a war beginning, and Margaret is about to prove that if you try to erase the wrong person, they might just rewrite the whole story. Like, share, comment, and subscribe to our channel. We always appreciate the time you spent here with us. I knew the moment I stepped onto the wraparound porch that this wasn't a dinner. It was a performance. The air in our small Midwestern town was biting, that flat gray cold that settles over the cornfields in November and doesn't lift until March. But inside the Stone family farmhouse, everything was aggressively, performatively warm. My mother Diane had outdone herself. The scent of roasted sage and caramelized onions hit me like a physical wall designed to smother any tension before it could even breathe. But it was the voices that gave it away. There were too many of them. This wasn't just family. I could hear the booming laugh of Pastor Miller, the wheezing chuckle of the town council president, and the obsequious murmurs of my father's plant supervisors. My parents hadn't invited me home for turkey. They had invited me to be an extra in a scene they had meticulously blocked out weeks ago. I walked in, shaking the cold off my coat, and immediately felt the familiar suffocating weight of the family hierarchy. I was Margaret Stone, nearly 30, a turnaround consultant in Chicago who salvaged failing companies for a living. I commanded boardrooms, I stripped down inefficiencies and saved livelihoods. But the second my boots hit the hardwood of the entryway, I was just Leonard's girl, the wayward daughter playing city mouse until she came to her senses. My father, Leonard Stone, stood by the fireplace holding a crystal tumbler of scotch like a scepter. He was the CEO of Stone Ridge Steel, the man who built the fabricator that built this town. Beside him was my brother Hunter, 2 years older, softer around the jaw, and wearing a cashmere sweater that cost more than most of the plant workers made in a week. Hunter was the golden boy, perpetually insulated from consequences, smiling that easy, lazy smile of a man who has never had to fight for a single thing in his life. The erasure began before we even sat down. It was subtle, woven into the greetings like a poison thread. "Margaret," Aunt Patty chirped, squeezing my arm too hard. "Still doing that computer thing in the city." I started to correct her, to explain that I managed high-stakes corporate restructuring, but she was already looking past me. "You'll come home when you're ready to settle down, right? The city is fun for a while, but it's not real life." They spoke about my career as if it were a gap year, a whimsical phase I would eventually grow out of once I accepted my biological destiny of becoming a mother and a PTA treasurer. I smiled tight and practiced. Internally, I noted the tactical layout of the room. They talked like my whole life was a placeholder, like I was born to be edited out. Dinner was the main act. The dining room table was extended to its full length, groaning under fine china and silver platters. My seat was telling. Leonard sat at the head naturally. Hunter was at his right hand. I was placed halfway down the table, squeezed between a deaf great-uncle and a floral centerpiece so large and aggressive it physically blocked my line of sight to the head of the table. I had to lean back just to see my father. The symbolism wasn't accidental. In the architecture of the Stone family, I was an obstruction to the view, easily hidden behind a wall of hydrangeas. We were halfway through the pumpkin pie when the ambient chatter died down. Leonard stood up. He tapped his spoon against his glass, the sharp ting-ting-ting cutting through the room. The silence was instant and reverent. This was the moment. I saw my mother clasp her hands until her knuckles turned white. Leonard cleared his throat, putting on his benevolent patriarch face. He spoke about the hard economic times, the pressure on American manufacturing, and the need to protect the legacy of Stone Ridge Steel. He used words like sacrifice and duty. "To keep this town afloat," my father boomed, his voice thick with rehearsed emotion, "a leader must know when to pass the torch. I am stepping down as CEO, effective immediately." He paused for effect. and I am handing the future of Stone Ridge Steel to the only person who carries the true spirit of this family, my son Hunter." The room erupted. Applause, cheers, a few misty eyes from the older supervisors. Hunter stood up, feigning surprise, soaking in the adoration. My father clapped him on the shoulder, beaming. I sat frozen. Not once had my name been mentioned. Not as a candidate, not as a consultant, not even as an afterthought. I had spent 10 years mastering the very skills this company desperately needed, yet I wasn't even a footnote in his speech. They were celebrating the ascendancy of a man who had never read a balance sheet without yawning, while I sat behind a flower arrangement effectively invisible. They were erasing me right in front of everyone, rewriting the family history to pretend I didn't exist as anything other than an audience member. The applause dragged on, grating against my nerves like sandpaper. I looked at Hunter's smug face, then at my father's triumphant grin. Something inside me, a cold, hard wire that had been tightening for decades, finally snapped. I didn't clap. Instead, I picked up my heavy crystal water glass and set it back down on the table. Thud. It wasn't a slam. It was a deliberate, heavy sound that acted like a period at the end of a sentence. It was loud enough to cut through the applause in my immediate vicinity. Heads turned. The clapping near me faltered, then died out, rippling up the table until the silence reached my father. Leonard looked over the centerpiece, his eyes locking onto mine. The smile didn't leave his face, but his eyes went dead. "Are you sure?" I asked, my voice calm but projecting clearly to the corners of the room, "that you want to tell this story in front of everyone?" The tension in the room spiked. My mother let out a small, terrified gasp. Leonard's jaw tightened. He leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping to a register that was meant only for me, but carried the weight of a sledgehammer. "Margaret, don't be jealous, and don't you dare threaten your brother's moment." He framed it perfectly. I was the bitter, jealous sister, a problem to be managed. He turned back to the room, raising his glass to toast Hunter, dismissing me entirely. I watched my brother flush with pleasure, accepting a crown he hadn't earned. My father thought he had won. He thought he had successfully edited me out of the narrative. I looked at them, sipping my water, a ghost of a smile touching my lips. He warned me not to threaten them. He had no idea. He didn't know that I wasn't threatening to take anything. You can't threaten to take what you already have. He didn't know I had already stripped them of something they thought they still owned, and by the time they realized it, this applause would be nothing but an echo in an empty room. To understand what I mean, you need to know how many times they tried to erase me before this night. To understand why I didn't clap at that dinner, you have to understand that my erasure wasn't a sudden event. It was a slow, methodical process that started when I was barely tall enough to see over a welding table. My childhood didn't happen on a playground. It happened on the concrete floor of Stone Ridge Steel, trailing behind my grandfather, Walter Stone. He was the founder, a man with hands like leather and a mind like a schematic. While other kids were learning nursery rhymes, Walter was teaching me how raw scrap became structural beams. He taught me that the factory was a living organism. He showed me how every bolt and rivet paid a mortgage somewhere in town. "Most people just hear the noise, Maggie," he would shout over the roar of the blast furnace. "But you see the whole system." Those hours in the plant were the only time I felt solid. Everywhere else, I was being ghosted in real time. The contrast between the factory floor and our dining room table was jarring. In the plant, if I asked why a conveyor belt was lagging, the foreman would stop and explain the mechanics, treating me with serious respect. But at home, my curiosity was treated as a cute parlor trick. I remember one Sunday dinner when I was 10. Walter proudly mentioned that I had caught a mislabeled shipment that would have cost the company thousands. I beamed, waiting for my father's approval. Instead, Leonard laughed, waving his fork dismissively. "She's got an eye for details, all right. She'll make a fantastic mother and a hell of a PTA treasurer one day." My mother immediately pivoted the conversation to new curtains, subtly reinforcing the only role that mattered for me. My competence was inconvenient, so they simply pretended it was domesticity in disguise. The erasure became literal when I turned 12. The company was planning a massive expansion, the biggest in its history. I had spent weeks reading about it in the papers, obsessing over the blueprints Walter left on his desk. I marched to the conference room, ready to sit in the corner and listen. Leonard stopped me at the door with a hand on my shoulder, heavy, immovable. "Margaret, go help your mother in the kitchen. This is business." 10 minutes later, I watched Hunter, 14 years old, and completely disinterested, be ushered into that same room, wearing an oversized blazer he hated. I ended up carrying in a tray of coffee an hour later. I stood in the doorway, invisible, holding the silver pitcher, while the board members nodded at my bored brother and called him the next CEO. I wasn't just excluded. I was made to serve the person who took my spot. The most brutal lesson, however, came at 17. I spent my summer internship analyzing energy usage across the plant's 3 main shifts. I found a massive inefficiency in how we powered down the furnaces, a tweak that could save the company 10 to 15% on utility costs, huge money. I wrote a clean, undeniable report and signed my name at the bottom in bold ink. I left it on Leonard's desk, heart pounding. 3 days later, I was walking past the main conference room and saw a slide deck on the projector. It was my data, my graphs, my conclusion. But standing at the head of the table was Hunter. He was stumbling through the presentation, clearly reading off notes he hadn't written, while Leonard beamed at him with a pride that made my stomach turn. I confronted Leonard in his office afterward, shaking with the injustice of it. "That was my work," I said. "He didn't even know what the figures meant." Leonard didn't even look up from his paperwork. He just sighed, the sound of a man dealing with an unruly toddler. "We're a family, Margaret. Sometimes you have to sacrifice the spotlight for the greater good. Hunter needs the win to build confidence with the board." When I protested, he spun his chair around, his eyes cold. "Don't be dramatic, and don't you dare threaten what your brother is building." That was the first time I heard it, the idea that my existence was a threat to Hunter's success. The final nail in the coffin came when Walter died. The day after the funeral, Leonard moved into the founder's office. I went in to see him and I stopped dead in the doorway. Behind the desk, where Walter had always kept a framed photo of me and him in safety goggles, there was a blank space. A moment later, Leonard hung a new picture, a professional studio portrait of Hunter solo. It wasn't just a redecorating choice, it was a statement. I had been evicted from the legacy. I realized then that I couldn't stay. If I stayed, I would eventually vanish completely. At 18, I secretly applied to out-of-state universities for finance and analytics. When the acceptance letters came, Leonard refused to pay a dime, calling it a waste of resources for a girl who would just end up married anyway. It didn't matter. I packed one suitcase and left at dawn, using scholarship money and savings I'd hidden away. As I drove past the Welcome to Stone Ridge sign, I felt a rush of adrenaline. I thought leaving didn't just feel like freedom. It felt like survival. I thought if I put enough miles between us, they couldn't erase me anymore. I was wrong. Because years later, sitting in a glass office hundreds of miles away, I would find proof that they weren't just done with me. They were about to erase everything I had ever loved. Chicago wasn't just a new city. It was a completely different planet from the suffocating atmosphere of the Stone farmhouse. My life there was small, cramped, and incredibly loud, and I loved every jagged edge of it. I lived in a shoebox apartment that smelled perpetually of burnt coffee and subway exhaust, balancing a full course load in finance, with 2 part-time jobs, one opening a coffee shop at 500 a.m., the other tutoring statistics until the library closed. I barely slept, but for the first time in my life, I was wide awake. I thrived on the grind. In my classes, I became obsessed with case studies of failing family businesses. I devoured stories of patriarchs who refused to innovate, and sons who inherited empires only to sell them for parts. In every failed quarterly report, I saw my father's stubbornness. In every disastrous merger, I saw my brother's laziness. I wasn't alone in this new world. I found people who actually looked at me when I spoke. There was Dr. Patel, a terrifyingly sharp professor, who once returned a paper to me with the note, "Stone, you have a spine of steel. Don't let the corporate world melt it." There was Kenzie, my roommate, who helped me navigate the imposter syndrome that hit every time I walked into a skyscraper. And there was Ethan. He was an EMT, grounded and unpretentious, the kind of guy who fixed engines on weekends and had zero interest in corporate posturing. He didn't try to shrink me. When I ranted about market caps and leverage ratios over dinner, he didn't roll his eyes like Leonard. He listened and asked questions. For the first time, I was building a reflection of myself that wasn't distorted by my family's funhouse mirror. After graduation, I landed a job as an analyst at a mid-sized firm specializing in distress turnarounds. My boss, Elena Ruiz, was a legend in the industry, a woman who could dissect a company's failure just by glancing at their accounts payable. She saw something in me immediately: my pattern recognition and my relentless, almost pathological work ethic. Under her, I became a weapon. I learned the dark arts of corporate governance. I learned how ownership structures actually worked, how proxy voting could topple giants, and how shareholder rights were often the only thing standing between a company and oblivion. I even started a strange hobby, buying single shares in random companies just to receive the shareholder packet, studying the fine print like it was scripture. I was building a fortress of competence brick by brick, far away from the people who said I was only good for carrying coffee. Then came the Tuesday that changed everything. I was sitting in a glass-walled conference room, flipping through a slide deck of potential acquisition targets for a client interested in Midwestern manufacturing. It was routine work, just vetting data, until I turned to page 42. My heart hammered against my ribs. There, projected on the glossy paper, was a stylized ridge of steel beams, the logo of Stone Ridge Steel. The room seemed to tilt. I blinked, hoping it was a mistake, but the numbers below the logo screamed catastrophe. I wasn't looking at a healthy company. I was looking at a corpse that hadn't realized it was dead yet. The debt-to-equity ratio was lethal. Orders had collapsed by 40% in 2 years. There was a looming default on a massive loan I didn't even know existed. This wasn't just business data. This was my hometown's heartbeat, and it was flatlining. I scrambled out of the meeting and dialed my father from the stairwell, my hands shaking. He answered on the 4th ring, sounding annoyed. When I tried to explain that I'd seen the numbers, that the debt load was unsustainable, that vultures were circling, he cut me off with a sharp laugh. "Margaret, stop being hysterical. You're reading too much into spreadsheets you don't understand." I pressed him, citing the specific loan covenants. His voice turned ice cold. "This is men's business, Margaret. Do not threaten the family reputation with your gossip." He hung up. Desperate, I texted Hunter. "The company is on a distressed sale list. Dad is drowning in debt. We need to talk." His reply came 2 minutes later, LOL. "It's high-level strategy, sis. Stay in your lane. We got this." I sat on the concrete steps of the stairwell, staring at the phone. The hurt washed over me first, the familiar sting of being dismissed, of being told I was too small to understand the world I grew up in. But as I sat there listening to the hum of the city I had conquered on my own, the hurt began to cool into something else, something sharper. They were going to drive the company off a cliff because their egos wouldn't let them listen to the girl they erased. Silence used to mean they had managed to make me disappear. Now silence meant I was sharpening the knife. I went home that night not to cry, but to work. I sat at my kitchen table, surrounded by cold takeout and stacks of paper, and I pulled up every public record I could find on Stone Ridge Steel. I dug through 50 years of filings, looking for the one thing my father's arrogance would have overlooked. And at 300 a.m., buried in a dusty digital archive of the original incorporation papers, I found it. I saw the distribution of the original shares. I saw the names of the people Walter had trusted before Leonard took over. I sat back, the glow of the laptop screen illuminating a smile that didn't reach my eyes. I had found the crack in their crown, the one thing they hadn't stripped from the people who built this place. The discovery I made at 300 a.m. changed the entire battlefield. My grandfather Walter hadn't just been a steelman, he was a community builder. I realized that while Leonard acted like the king of Stone Ridge, he didn't actually hold the keys to the kingdom. He held a massive chunk of shares, yes, and my mother held another block, but Walter had dispersed a significant percentage of the company's ownership among the people who helped him build it. Early shift managers, the original foreman, distant relatives, and retired office staff. Leonard didn't have absolute controlling interest. He just had inherited obedience. He assumed these people would always vote with him because they always had. He was banking on loyalty. I was banking on the fact that he was about to bankrupt them. I stood at a moral crossroads that night watching the sun come up over the Chicago skyline. I could walk away. I could let the bank foreclose or let some private equity firm chop the company up for scrap. It would be poetic justice to watch Leonard and Hunter lose everything because of their own arrogance. But then I closed my eyes and saw the faces of the people who actually mattered. I saw the welders who used to sneak me butterscotch candies when I was 6. I saw the payroll clerks who helped me with my science fair projects. These were the people my parents had quietly stripped of power and respect for decades. If the company went under, Leonard would be fine. He had golden parachutes and hidden assets. These people would lose their pensions. This wasn't just about me anymore. It was a rescue mission disguised as a hostile takeover. I started my quiet war with Gus Ramirez. Gus had been Walter's right-hand man, the foreman who ran the floor with an iron fist and a soft heart. He was retired now, living on a fixed income that depended entirely on Stone Ridge dividends. I met him at a worn-out diner halfway between Chicago and home, a neutral ground where no one would recognize us. He looked older, tired, his hands shaking slightly as he held his coffee. When I showed him the real financials, the debt, the impending sale, he didn't look surprised. He looked resigned. "Your grandpa always said you saw the whole system, Maggie," he murmured, staring into his cup. "He told me once, Hunter likes the title, but Margaret likes the work." Gus looked up, his eyes hardening. I can't watch Leonard drive this town into the ground just to save his pride. He signed his shares over to me right there on the Formica table. That signature was the first domino. For the next 3 months, I lived a double life. By day, I was the dutiful consultant in Chicago. By night and on weekends, I was a ghost traveling to collect the pieces of my family's legacy. I visited a widow in an assisted living facility in Indiana, a woman whose husband had been one of the first investors. She held my hand and told me she remembered when Leonard cut the retiree health benefits to pay for a remodel of the executive suite. She signed. I flew to Arizona to meet a distant cousin who still remembered the way Hunter had bullied him at a family reunion 15 years ago. He didn't care about the money, he just wanted to vote against the golden boy. He signed. I tracked down a former CFO who Leonard had forced out for daring to suggest that Hunter wasn't qualified. It was a crusade. Every share I bought wasn't just a financial transaction. It was a vote of no confidence in my father, and a vote of trust in me. I couldn't do this openly. If Leonard saw me coming, the war would be over before it began. He would dilute the shares, sue me into oblivion, or poison the board against me. I needed armor. I hired Trish Nguyen, a razor-sharp corporate attorney who specialized in stealth acquisitions. We set up a series of anonymous LLCs with boring, nondescript names to hold the shares. "This isn't a movie, Margaret," Trish warned me as we filed the paperwork. "If he catches wind of this, he doesn't lose quietly. He finds a way to crush you legally or financially. We have to be invisible until the trap shuts." The pressure was agonizing. There were nights I lay awake staring at the ceiling, wrestling with a gnawing sense of guilt. Was I doing this to save the town? Or was I doing this to hurt them? Was I just the jealous daughter exacting revenge? But then I would reread the notes I kept from my meetings. The widow, the cousin, the workers, they weren't seeking revenge. They were scared. They were placing their hope in my competence. They were betting on me. I realized that saving the company and stripping my father of his power were the same act. He had become the threat. By November, the spreadsheet on my laptop told me I was close. I had aggregated 44% of the voting stock. It was a massive number, but it wasn't enough. Leonard and my mother still controlled a combined 45%. I needed 51 to walk into that boardroom and stop the sale. I needed one last significant block of shares. I looked at the name at the bottom of my list. Raymond Holt. He was the estranged co-founder, a man who had left the company 20 years ago after a massive shouting fallout with Leonard. He hated my father. But he was also unpredictable, bitter, and notoriously difficult. He held the final 7% I needed. If he said no, the plan stalled and the company died. If he said yes, I would own the one thing my family used to threaten me with my entire life: absolute power. I packed my bag and headed for the door. It was time to make the deal. The week before Thanksgiving, I sat in a booth at a diner 2 towns over watching Raymond Holt read a document. Raymond was a hard man, weathered by decades of resentment with eyes that looked like flint. He hadn't spoken to my father in 20 years. He held the final 7% of the shares I needed. He put the paper down and looked at me, searching for a lie. "Tell me the truth, Margaret," he rasped. "Are you doing this to destroy your parents because I'd enjoy that, or are you doing this to save the plant?" I looked at him, and for a moment I considered lying. I considered telling him exactly what he wanted to hear, but I was done with performances. "Both truths live in me, Raymond," I said, my voice steady. "I won't pretend they didn't try to erase me. I won't pretend I don't want them to feel a fraction of the powerlessness they forced on me. But I also won't let them erase this town to pay for their mistakes. They are going to sell it for parts. I am going to make it work." Raymond held my gaze for a long, silent minute. Then he uncapped his pen. "Your grandfather would have been proud," he muttered, and he signed his name. With that stroke of ink, I hit 51.3%. I was the majority shareholder of Stone Ridge Steel. We snapped back to the farmhouse. The applause for Hunter was still ringing in the air. My father was still smiling, raising his glass to the son he had anointed king. The room was warm, filled with the smell of roasting turkey and the sickly sweet scent of sycophancy. I stood up. I set my water glass down on the table with that heavy, deliberate thud I mentioned earlier. The sound was an anchor dropping in deep water. The applause faltered and died. Leonard looked at me, annoyance flickering in his eyes. "Margaret," he warned, his voice low, "sit down." I didn't sit. I reached into my bag and pulled out a thick manila envelope. It contained the executed transfer documents, the proxy statements, and a 1-page legal summary confirming my controlling interest. I slid it across the polished mahogany table. It stopped directly between Leonard's Scotch glass and Hunter's empty plate. "I'm afraid that's not possible, Dad," I said. My voice wasn't loud, but in the sudden vacuum of silence it carried to the kitchen. "Because you don't have the authority to appoint a CEO anymore." Leonard laughed, a sharp barking sound. "Excuse me, I am the chairman and the majority owner of this company." "You were," I corrected him. "As of this morning's filing, you are a minority shareholder." I pointed to the envelope. "Open it." He stared at me, the smile sliding off his face like wet paint. He ripped the envelope open, his hands shaking slightly, not from fear, but from rage. He pulled out the summary. I watched his eyes scan the lines. I saw the moment the numbers hit him. The color drained from his face, leaving him a waxy gray. This is impossible," he stammered. "Who?" "Gus Ramirez," I said, listing the names like I was reading a verdict. "The widow of Arthur Miller. Your cousin David in Arizona, the former CFO you fired 3 years ago. And Raymond Holt." Each name landed like a physical blow. Hunter looked back and forth between us, his mouth slightly open, looking like a child who had walked into the middle of a play he didn't understand. "What is she talking about, Dad?" he whined. My mother stood up, her napkin clutched to her chest. "Margaret, stop this. We are a family. You can't bring business into this house." I turned to the room, addressing the stunned guests, the pastor, the plant supervisors, the neighbors. "Since we are all sharing news," I said, my voice projecting clearly, "you need to know that Stone Ridge Steel is currently insolvent. My father and brother were negotiating a sale to a private equity firm that would have liquidated the assets and closed the plant within 18 months. A gasp went through the room. The supervisors looked at Leonard with sudden dawning horror. I have stopped that sale. I have assumed voting control of the board. We are not selling. We are restructuring. And we are going to save this company, but not under this management. I looked at Hunter. He looked like someone had just ripped the floor out from under him. He was holding the edge of the table, his knuckles white. You didn't just try to erase me, I said, looking from my brother to my father. You stripped them. I gestured to the workers in the room, of the ownership and respect they earned. You treated their shares like they didn't matter, because you thought they were too small to fight back. I'm giving that back. Leonard slammed his fist on the table, making the silverware jump. He leaned over the centerpiece, his face twisted into a mask of pure venom. You traitor, he spat. You ungrateful, jealous little. If you do this, Margaret, if you embarrass me like this, you are no daughter of mine. I will turn this whole town against you. I will make you wish you never came back. It was the ultimate threat. The threat of total exile. The threat of being truly, finally erased. I looked him in the eye and I felt absolutely nothing. No fear, no sadness, just the cold, clean clarity of steel. You already tried to erase me, Leonard, I said quietly. All I did was stop you from erasing everyone else, too. I didn't wait for a response. I turned and walked out of the dining room. I left the envelope and the illusion of their power sitting on the table amidst the cooling turkey and the stunned silence. I stepped out onto the porch, the heavy oak door clicking shut behind me. The cold night air hit my face sharp and biting. I looked toward the horizon where the distant orange glow of the factory stacks lit up the clouds. I stood there shivering slightly, realizing what I had done. I had just stripped them of the crown they promised my brother since he was a kid. I felt a surge of triumph, but as the wind picked up howling through the bare trees, a darker thought settled in. I had won the battle, but the war was just starting. What I didn't know yet was how hard they and the town they claimed to own would fight to punish me for it. If I thought the dinner was the explosion, the weeks that followed were the radioactive fallout. In a town like Stone Ridge, truth travels slower than gossip, and the story Leonard planted took root instantly. The narrative on the street wasn't that I had saved the company, it was that the greedy city daughter had stolen her brother's birthright. When I walked into the local diner for coffee 3 days later, the clamor of silverware against plates stopped dead. Heads turned, eyes narrowed. The waitress, a woman who had known me since kindergarten, slammed my mug down with enough force to spill hot coffee over the rim. She didn't offer a refill. When I walked back to my rental car, I found a piece of notebook paper shoved under the wiper blade. In jagged, angry capitals it read, "Go back to the city before you ruin everything." I didn't leave. Instead, I called an all-hands meeting on the factory floor. It was a cold Tuesday morning. 300 workers stood in the cavernous main bay, their breath visible in the chilly air, arms crossed over Carhartt jackets. The hostility was thick enough to taste. I stood on a makeshift riser, a projector screen behind me. I didn't start with a speech about family or legacy. I started with math. I projected the company's real financials onto the concrete wall, the jagged red lines of debt, the plummeting cash flow, the liquidation plan my father had hidden in a safe. You've heard I stole this company, I said, my voice echoing off the steel beams. The truth is, there wasn't going to be a company left to steal by Christmas. A murmur went through the crowd. Then Earl, a shift supervisor with 30 years on the floor, stepped forward. "That's just numbers on a wall," he shouted, pointing a gloved finger at me. "Your daddy kept us paid. You're just another outsider looking to strip the copper wiring and run. How many of us are you firing today?" The crowd rumbled in agreement. This was the test. I looked Earl in the eye. "0, I said. "There are no mass layoffs. We are implementing a wage freeze for management, not the floor. We are investing in the new CNC machines you've been requesting for 5 years. And we are restarting the safety protocols my father cut to save money." I paused, letting the silence stretch. The only thing I'm threatening, Earl, is the mismanagement that almost cost you your pension. Earl didn't smile, but he lowered his hand. The tension in the room shifted from aggression to cautious skepticism. It wasn't a victory, but it was a foothold. The battle at home was bloodier. My mother Diane called me every night weeping. She didn't ask about the business, she attacked my character. You chose money over your own blood, she sobbed into the phone. How can you sleep? You've humiliated your father. He won't even leave the house. I tried to explain that I chose survival over a lie, but she wouldn't hear it. We are a family, she wailed. And you broke us. I finally had to tell her firmly, you chose Hunter's ego over my existence and the town's future. I didn't break us, Mom. I just stopped hiding the cracks. Leonard was silent. He refused to attend board meetings, communicating only through a lawyer who threatened to sue me for everything from breach of fiduciary duty to emotional distress. But the paperwork Trish and I had assembled was ironclad. He was powerless, and his silence was the sulking of a king in exile. Hunter, however, didn't stay silent. He showed up at my rental house a week later at midnight. He was drunk, swaying on my porch, his eyes red-rimmed and wild. He pounded on the door until I opened it. You erased me, he slurred, stumbling into the entryway. You took it all. I was supposed to be the CEO. I'm nothing without that chair. You erased me, Margaret. He looked pathetic, a man-child who had never been told no, stripped of the costume he thought was his skin. I felt a flicker of pity, but I stamped it out. Pity had allowed this rot to spread in the first place. I didn't erase you, Hunter, I said quietly, leaning against the doorframe. I just took away the script Dad wrote for you. I have nothing, he shouted, tears streaming down his face. I'm invisible now. I looked at him, really looked at him, and saw the reflection of my own childhood in his panic. Now you know what it felt like, I told him, my voice devoid of malice. Now you know what it felt like, every time you watched them erase me and said nothing. Every time you took credit for my work. Every time you sat in the meetings I was barred from. I opened the door back up. Go home, Hunter. Get sober. Find out who you are when your last name isn't on the paycheck. Because the brother I want to know isn't a CEO. He's just a man. He stared at me, stunned by the reversal, and stumbled out into the night. The next few months were a grind. I practically lived at the plant. I walked the floor every day, learning names, asking questions, actually listening. I fixed the broken heating in the break room, something Leonard had ignored for 2 winters. I ended the practice of unpaid mandatory overtime. Slowly, the ice began to thaw. The local paper, which had run a scathing editorial blaming me for the family feud, published a letters to the editor section that stopped me in my tracks. To the editor, the new management actually paid us for the extra shift last week. First time in 4 years. Maybe we should give her a chance. It was signed, a welder. Then another. She knows the machinery better than the last guy. The narrative was cracking. American values of fairness and hard work were starting to override the blind loyalty to the old regime. One afternoon I was walking through the fabrication bay. Earl, the supervisor who had shouted at me, was inspecting a weld. He saw me coming. He didn't smile, but he gave a curt, respectful nod. Boss, he muttered as I passed. I walked out into the winter sunlight, feeling a warmth that had nothing to do with the temperature. The town was starting to see me not the daughter Leonard described, but the woman I actually was. The story was changing. For once, they weren't the only ones holding the pen. Exactly 1 year after the dinner that shattered my family, I walked into the lobby of Stone Ridge Steel. The silence of the impending shutdown was gone, replaced by the steady, rhythmic thrum of machinery that vibrated through the floorboards, the heartbeat of a healthy company. We weren't just surviving, we were hiring. We had posted a modest profit in the 3rd quarter, enough to distribute bonuses to the floor crew for the first time in a decade. I wasn't running the day-to-day operations, though. I had hired Angela Cruz, a steel-spined operations veteran from Detroit, who didn't care about local politics, to serve as CEO. I stayed on as chair of the board, guiding the strategy, but I made sure to leave the micromanagement at the door. The biggest change, however, was in the lobby itself. For 20 years, the main wall had been a shrine to Leonard Stone, row after row of photos of him shaking hands with governors and cutting ribbons. That wall was gone. In its place was a timeline I commissioned. It featured the faces that actually built this place: Gus Ramirez covered in soot in 1985, the women who ran the logistics office during the crunch of the 90s, my grandfather Walter smiling next to a blast furnace. And there, right in the center of the timeline, was a small, grainy photograph from 1998. It showed a 12-year-old girl in an oversized hard hat, holding a clipboard, looking at the camera with serious, intelligent eyes. It was me. For the first time in my life, my younger self was allowed to exist in the official history. I touched the glass frame gently, feeling a quiet peace settle in my chest. I wasn't a ghost here anymore. My relationship with my family had shifted too. Not fixed, but altered, like a bone that heals a little crooked, but strong. Leonard had attended his first board meeting in months that morning. He sat in the back row, not at the head of the table. He didn't speak much, but he listened. Afterward, as I was packing up my papers, he lingered by the door. He looked older, smaller in his suit. "The numbers are good, Margaret," he muttered, looking at his shoes. I didn't see the inefficiencies. I didn't see a lot of things." It wasn't a groveling apology, and I didn't need it to be. It was an admission of blindness. He had spent his life looking past me. Now he was forced to look at the work I had done. Diane had reached out in her own way. A week before Thanksgiving, a box arrived at my apartment. Inside were dozens of photos I thought were lost pictures of me winning the state math decathlon, my college graduation, the newspaper clippings of my first big turnaround deal in Chicago. She had kept them all in a shoebox at the back of her closet. On top was a note written in her looping script: "We were wrong not to display these. We were wrong not to see you." It didn't undo the years of neglect, but it was a start. As for Hunter, he was living 2 towns over, working a sales job for a solar company. He was in therapy, learning how to be a person instead of a prince. We texted occasionally. He wasn't my best friend, but he wasn't my rival anymore. He was just a guy trying to figure out who he was without a title to prop him up. I accepted these gestures, but I kept my boundaries like high walls. Reconciliation didn't mean returning to the old roles. I refused to hand them back control over my emotions or the company. I controlled the invite list now, which brought me to tonight. Thanksgiving dinner. It wasn't in the farmhouse. It was in my Chicago apartment, a space that was entirely mine. The table wasn't set with fine china or rigid name cards. It was a chaotic, beautiful mess of mismatched plates and serving bowls. The air didn't smell like tension. It smelled of garlic-roasted turkey and loud laughter. My guests were the people who had kept me tethered to reality when I felt like floating away. Kenzie was pouring wine with a heavy hand. Ethan was carving the turkey, arguing playfully with Gus Ramirez about the best way to sharpen a knife. Angela Cruz was there, laughing with the aunt who had supported me during the takeover. Even Earl, the skeptic from the factory floor, had driven up with his wife. There were no speeches about legacy. No one was performing. We were just eating, drinking, and being together. This was my chosen family. This was the table I had built. Later that night, I stepped out onto the balcony. The city stretched out before me, a grid of golden lights against the darkness. The wind was cold, reminding me of that night outside the farmhouse a year ago. But this time, I didn't feel alone. I thought about the narrative my parents had tried to write for me: the jealous, disposable daughter, the supporting character in her brother's life. They had used family as a weapon to keep me in line, to edit me out whenever I became inconvenient. I took a sip of wine and looked at my reflection in the glass door. I had taken all of that pain, all of that erasure, and turned it into fuel. I had built a legacy that no one could strip from me because I had earned every inch of it. If you are listening to this and you have a family that uses love as leverage, or if you feel like your existence is being conveniently edited out to make room for someone else's ego, listen to me. They want you to believe that their story is the only one that matters. They want you to believe that leaving is a failure. But you have the power to pick up the pen. You have the resilience to get back up the community, to protect what matters, and the freedom to choose your own lane, not the one assigned to you at birth. My name is Margaret Stone. I was the daughter they tried to erase. The night I stripped them of their crown, I didn't just take a company, I took back my story. And if they ever threaten to erase you, remember, as long as you're still here, the ink is still wet. Margaret finally reclaimed her narrative, proving that the most important stories are the ones we write for ourselves. If this story resonated with you, or if you have ever had to fight to be seen within your own family, please consider hitting that subscribe button. We read every single comment of your thoughts. Thank you for listening. This has been a story from Radiance. We'll see you next time.